By April 1945, the Third Reich was a hollow shell. The German West Wall, Hitler's great defensive masterpiece, had been shattered into rubble and scrap metal. General George S. Patton's Third Army was moving so fast that his mapmakers couldn't keep up. Supply lines stretched to breaking point. Fuel convoys raced through the night just to keep the tanks rolling. This was Patton in his element. Not sitting in a command tent, not moving pins on a map, moving, always moving. His officers would later say that Patton had a physical reaction to stillness. He couldn't eat properly when his army wasn't advancing. He couldn't sleep. He paced, he swore, he read the Bible and Rommel's memoirs in the same sitting. His men both feared and worshipped him. They called him Old Blood and Guts, to which Patton himself once replied with characteristic bluntness, "Yeah, my blood and their guts." But in the spring of 1945, Patton was something beyond a general. He was a man who could see what was coming. While other commanders were calculating the final miles of this war, Patton was already thinking about the first miles of the next one. He had watched the Soviet Union with the eyes of a historian and the instincts of a cavalryman. He knew how empires moved. He knew how power filled a vacuum. And as his Third Army tore through the heart of Germany, he could see, with painful, almost prophetic clarity, exactly what kind of vacuum the Allied halt orders were about to create. To the east, the Red Army was a massive, slow-moving tide of steel, still hundreds of miles from Berlin. They were battered, exhausted, and badly supplied. Patton, however, was in the clear. He had the tanks, he had the fuel, he had the momentum, and he had the open road straight to the German capital. Then the radio crackled. It wasn't an order to attack, it was an order to stop. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, acting on direct instructions from Washington and bound by the agreements made at Yalta, sent word to Patton, "Berlin is no longer a military objective. Halt your advance. Let the Russians take the city." For a lesser man, this might have been a relief. The war was nearly won. Why spend American lives on a city already agreed upon as a Soviet prize? Go home, celebrate, let the diplomats sort out the rest. But Patton was not a lesser man, and what he said next, in those tense, furious final weeks of the war, would become the most controversial "I told you so" in military history.
Before we continue, if you're enjoying these World War II stories and want to see more, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. Alright, let's get back to the story. To understand why Patton reacted the way he did, you have to understand what had already been decided, without him, without the soldiers on the ground, and arguably without the full grasp of its consequences. In February 1945, the Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, had met at the Yalta Conference on the Crimean coast. The official purpose was to coordinate the final defeat of Nazi Germany. The unofficial reality was a negotiation over who would control what was left of Europe when the shooting stopped. Germany was carved into occupation zones. The Soviet Union would control the East. The Americans, British, and French would manage the West. Berlin, sitting deep inside Soviet-designated territory, was allocated to joint occupation in theory, but surrounded by Soviet forces in practice. Roosevelt was dying. His aides later admitted he barely had the stamina for the negotiations. Churchill fought harder, but he was bargaining from a position of weakness. Britain was exhausted, broke, and dependent on American support. Stalin, by contrast, arrived at Yalta having already positioned millions of troops across Eastern Europe. He wasn't negotiating from a map, he was negotiating from facts on the ground. And those facts on the ground were exactly what Patton wanted to change. When Patton looked at the map, he didn't see the lines drawn at Yalta. He saw the physical reality of where his tanks were and where the Red Army wasn't. His lead elements had crossed the Rhine, shattered what remained of German resistance in the west, and were thundering toward the Elbe, the river that formed the agreed boundary between American and Soviet advance zones. Eisenhower, for his part, was not a reckless man. He was a supreme coordinator, a political general in the best and most necessary sense. He genuinely believed that if American forces crossed the Elbe and raced for Berlin ahead of the Soviets, it could destroy the carefully constructed Allied coalition at the very moment of victory. Stalin, he feared, might interpret such a move as a deliberate provocation, proof that the West intended to encircle and undermine the USSR. The consequences, Eisenhower argued, could be catastrophic. He also believed, based on faulty intelligence that he later came to regret, in the existence of a so-called national redoubt. The theory held that Hitler's most fanatical SS units were retreating to the Bavarian Alps and the Austrian mountains to establish a fortified stronghold for a last, prolonged guerrilla resistance. This, Eisenhower decided, was the real military threat. He wanted Patton to pivot south toward Bavaria, not east toward Berlin. Patton didn't care about the national redoubt. He called it bluntly a figment of someone's imagination. He was right. The redoubt barely existed. It was a myth, partly Nazi propaganda, partly Allied intelligence failure. What Patton did care about was the prestige of the bayonet. He had a theory, brutal in its simplicity, that in the post-war world, power would belong to whoever was there, not whoever had the best legal arguments, not whoever had signed the most agreements, whoever was physically present with soldiers and guns when the dust settled. And so when the halt order arrived, Patton reportedly seized the telephone and rang his direct superior, General Omar Bradley. Those who were present in the command post that day described a one-sided conversation that left the entire staff silent. "For God's sake, Brad, we shouldn't care about lines on a map. If we don't take Berlin now, the Russians will take it, and they will never leave. Never. We're handing them half of Europe on a silver platter, and we're doing it with a smile on our face like we think it's a gift." Bradley told him the decision was final. Eisenhower's orders reflected the wishes of the President and the Joint Chiefs. The army would halt at the Elbe. Patton slammed the phone down, walked to the window of his command post, and stared east toward a city he was never going to reach. According to his aide, Colonel Charles Codman, he said nothing for a full minute. Then, quietly, he said, "God help the people we're leaving behind." Patton's fury at the halt order might have remained a private military grievance, the complaint of an ambitious general denied his final prize, if it hadn't been for what happened next. As American forces settled along the Elbe and watched the Soviets pour into the territory they had been forbidden to enter, Patton's intelligence officers began filing reports that darkened his mood from angry to apocalyptic. It wasn't just Berlin. Across the agreed Soviet occupation zones, a pattern was emerging with brutal consistency. Political leaders, mayors, regional officials, civic organizers who had survived the Nazi period were vanishing. Men who had cooperated with American liberators in one week found themselves arrested by Soviet security forces the next. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, was operating not like a law enforcement agency, but like an occupation force carrying out a purge. Patton's officers interviewed refugees streaming west in their hundreds of thousands. The accounts were grim and consistent. Systematic looting, not the opportunistic theft of individual soldiers, but organized, industrial-scale stripping of machinery, infrastructure, and resources. Mass deportations, summary executions of anyone deemed a threat to Soviet authority. For Patton, this wasn't a surprise. It was a confirmation. He had never trusted the Soviet alliance. He understood its necessity. Hitler had to be defeated, and the Red Army had done the heaviest lifting in the East. He didn't deny that. But he had always believed that the moment the common enemy was gone, the ideological reality of the Soviet state would reassert itself with a vengeance. In his private diary, a document that would later cause enormous controversy when selected passages were leaked, Patton wrote with a candor that his superiors found deeply embarrassing. The difficulty in understanding the Russian is that we do not take cognizance of the fact that he is not a European, but an Asiatic, and therefore thinks deviously. We can no more understand them than they can understand us. The language is offensive by modern standards, and it should be acknowledged as such, but strip away the racial framing, which reflected the prejudices of his era as much as his own, and there is a geopolitical argument underneath it that historians have taken seriously. Patton believed that the Soviet leadership operated on fundamentally different assumptions about power, legitimacy, and international agreement than Western liberal democracies did. He didn't think Stalin would honor Yalta. He didn't think promises made at conference tables meant anything to a regime that had survived by ruthlessness. And he was largely correct. By the summer of 1945, Patton was not merely expressing frustration in his diary. He was making his arguments publicly and loudly. He told his assembled staff on more than one occasion that the U.S. Army was at the absolute peak of its capability and capacity. It was battle-hardened, well-supplied, and organized around the most effective logistics system in military history. The Red Army, by contrast, was exhausted. Its supply lines were stretched across thousands of devastated territory. Its equipment was worn. Its men were, by any objective measure, fought out. In that narrow window, Patton argued, America had a military advantage it would never have again, and it was squandering it. He proposed what he called, carefully, a limited war. Not a total conflict, not an attempt to conquer Russia, simply use the existing American military presence to push Soviet forces back to the borders they had held in 1939, before Stalin's pact with Hitler had allowed him to swallow the Baltic states and eastern Poland. Establish those borders by force, and then negotiate from a position of genuine strength rather than diplomatic goodwill. He said to a visiting official whose name history has preserved in the notes of Patton's aide, "We can lick them now easier than we can lick them later. The window is open. If we don't go through it, they will close it, and we will spend the next 50 years trying to find a way back in." The remark was reported up the chain of command. It was not well received. Berlin was not the only city Patton watched slip away. By early May 1945, the Third Army had reached the western borders of Czechoslovakia. The Czech resistance, which had fought a brutal, desperate underground war against Nazi occupation for 6 years, was rising up in Prague. They were begging for American support. Patton's forward scouts reported that the road to the capital was open. He requested permission to advance. The request was, by this point, almost a formality. Patton knew what the answer would be, but he made it anyway. The answer was no. Eisenhower, again bound by the agreements reached with the Soviets, ordered American forces to halt at the Pilsen Line. Prague, like Berlin, was in the Soviet sphere. The Red Army would liberate it. Patton drove to the front himself to see it. He stood at the edge of his advance zone and looked toward a city that his army could have reached in hours. He later wrote that watching the Czechs realize they were being handed to the east was one of the most painful experiences of his life. He told a subordinate, Brigadier General Hobart Gay, one of the few men Patton genuinely trusted, "I feel like a man who has worked all day to build a house and then is told he can't sleep in it. Worse than that, I'm told I have to give it to the man who burned down the last one." The men who had been liberated from Nazi rule in Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, and Romania would spend the next 40 years under a different kind of unfreedom. Many of the resistance leaders who had coordinated with American intelligence services were, within months, arrested by Soviet security forces. Some were executed. Some disappeared. The very people who had believed most fervently in the Western promise of liberation paid the heaviest price for the Yalta agreements. As the war formally ended in May 1945, Patton was appointed military governor of Bavaria. It was, in the polite language of the Army, a prestigious posting. In reality, it was a way to give Patton something important sounding to do while keeping him away from anything geopolitically sensitive. He was spectacularly bad at it. The denazification program, the systematic removal of former Nazi Party members from positions in German civil society, was the central policy of the occupation. Patton implemented it with something approaching contempt. He argued that Germany needed to be rebuilt, and the people who knew how to run its institutions were almost inevitably former party members. Removing all of them, he said, was like trying to run New York City after firing everyone who had ever voted Democrat. The analogy caused a scandal. The press reported it. Eisenhower summoned him. Patton was relieved of command of the Third Army and reassigned to lead the 15th Army, a largely administrative force tasked with compiling the Army's historical record. It was, in effect, a demotion. Patton knew it. His diary entries from this period become increasingly dark, less strategic calculation and more raw grief. He writes about feeling that he has been muzzled, that the things he is not allowed to say are the most important things anyone could say. I have done my duty to my country. I am not sure my country has done its duty to history. On December 9, 1945, George S. Patton went pheasant hunting near Mannheim, Germany. It was a Sunday, and it was one of the small, ordinary pleasures he allowed himself in a period that had otherwise been characterized by professional humiliation and personal restlessness. On the way back, his staff car, moving slowly through the fog, was struck by a U.S. Army truck that had turned unexpectedly across the road. The crash was low speed. Everyone else in the vehicle walked away unhurt. Patton was paralyzed from the neck down. He had survived North Africa, Sicily, and the Battle of the Bulge. He had been shot at, bombed, and strafed. He had driven through territory so dangerous that his own security detail begged him to stop. And in the end, what put him down was a minor road accident in peacetime Germany. He lingered for 12 days. During that time, his wife Beatrice flew over from the United States. His doctors held out some hope that he might regain some movement. Patton himself appears to have known better. On December 21, 1945, he died of pulmonary edema and heart failure. He was 60 years old. He was buried, at his own request, alongside the men of the Third Army who had died in the Battle of the Bulge, at the American Cemetery in Ham, Luxembourg. He had said that he wanted to be with his soldiers. True to form, in death as in life, he got what he asked for. The conspiracy theories began almost immediately. The circumstances of the accident were genuinely unusual. The truck driver gave inconsistent accounts. A former OSS officer named Douglas Bazata claimed, decades later, that the crash had been arranged, that powerful figures in Washington had decided Patton's increasingly vocal anti-Soviet rhetoric made him too dangerous to be allowed to return home and speak freely to the American public. Most mainstream historians regard the conspiracy theories as unproven and unlikely. The accident has the terrible anticlimactic logic of actual history, the kind of ending that fiction would reject as too mundane for a man of Patton's stature. But the questions have never entirely gone away, and perhaps that says something not about what happened on that foggy December road, but about how large Patton loomed, and how many people on multiple sides had reason to prefer his silence. History is rarely kind enough to deliver clean verdicts, but in the case of George S. Patton, it came close. Within months of his death, the alliance he had always disbelieved in collapsed into the Cold War he had always predicted. The Iron Curtain, Churchill's famous phrase for what Patton had been screaming about in operational briefings for months, descended almost exactly along the lines where the Allied armies had been ordered to stop. The decision not to race for Berlin produced 40 years of divided Germany, the Berlin airlift, the Berlin Wall, and a nuclear standoff that brought the world to the edge of annihilation on more than one occasion. The decision to let the Soviets take Prague delivered Czechoslovakia into 50 years of communist rule, punctuated by the crushing of the Prague Spring in 1968, Soviet tanks rolling down the same streets where the Czechs had once waited for Patton. Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, the Baltic states, all of them disappeared behind the curtain. The political leaders who had cooperated with the West were imprisoned or shot. The promises of free elections made at Yalta evaporated before the ink was dry. Was Patton right? On the broad strategic question, that halting at the Elbe and conceding Eastern Europe to Stalin created a catastrophic and long-lasting geopolitical disaster, the answer is yes, largely. The Cold War was not inevitable. It was the product of specific decisions made in specific moments, and the decisions made in the spring of 1945 shaped everything that followed. On the narrower military question, Could Patton have done something about it? The answer is genuinely more complicated. His limited war proposal was breathtaking in its audacity and its recklessness in equal measure. The Red Army, exhausted as it was, had just fought the largest land war in human history. The American public was desperate for peace. The atomic bomb had not yet been used, and its implications were not yet fully understood. A new war in Europe in the summer of 1945 might have produced outcomes far worse than the Cold War. And yet, Patton's final written words on the subject, scrawled in his diary in the last weeks before the accident that killed him, have the quality of a man who knows he will not be heard but cannot stop speaking. We promised these people freedom. Instead, we gave them a different color of uniform to fear. They traded the brown shirt for the red star and called it liberation. I hope to God the men who made these decisions can sleep at night. I know I can't. George S. Patton was, by any measure, a deeply flawed man. He was vain, intemperate, and capable of cruelty. He slapped a shell-shocked soldier and nearly ended his own career. He made statements that were racist, reckless, and diplomatically catastrophic. He was not a man you would want running a democracy. But he was a man who could read a map, not just the military map of where the tanks were, but the political map of where power was moving and what it would do when it arrived. He saw the Iron Curtain before it had a name. He predicted the Cold War while the victory parades were still being planned, and he was silenced, sidelined, and then killed by a peacetime road accident before he could bring his arguments home to the American people. Whether that makes him a tragic visionary or a dangerous warmonger is a question that historians are still arguing about. But it is not, 75 years later, a question that can be dismissed. Was Patton a warmonger who would have triggered World War III, or a visionary who could have prevented the Cold War? The question doesn't have a clean answer, but it deserves to be asked, and asked honestly. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to know what happened when Patton confronted the Russian general who refused to raise a toast to the American dead, click the video right here. If you're enjoying these World War II stories and want to see more, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel.